At exactly 8:45 a.m., Sarah Martinez sat in an unmarked surveillance van parked across the street from First National Bank, watching the morning flow of customers and employees through high-powered binoculars. Detective Mike Rodriguez was positioned inside the bank, posing as a customer opening a new account, while County Detective Linda Harrison coordinated backup units from a command post 3 blocks away. The anonymous text message had haunted Sarah through the few hours of sleep she had managed to grab, and now she found herself wondering whether she was walking into a breakthrough or a carefully planned ambush. The person who had contacted her knew details about Harold Chin's financial arrangements that hadn't been made public, suggesting either inside knowledge or direct involvement in the crimes they were investigating. Sarah's radio crackled softly in her earpiece. "Martinez, this is Harrison. We've got eyes on all entrances to the bank, and Rodriguez confirms he's in position near the safety deposit box area. Are you ready to go in?" Sarah checked her weapon one more time and adjusted the wire that would allow the surveillance team to monitor her conversation. "Copy that. I'm moving to the front entrance now. Remember, we don't know who we're dealing with or what their intentions might be." The morning air was crisp as Sarah walked across the street, her senses hyper-alert for any sign of danger or surveillance from unknown parties. The bank was busy with typical morning customers, providing good cover for the law enforcement operation, but also creating additional variables that could complicate things if the situation went bad. As Sarah entered the bank, she immediately spotted Mike at the new account's desk, maintaining his cover while keeping a clear view of both the safety deposit box area and the main entrance. She moved to the customer service area and checked in with the receptionist, identifying herself as Detective Martinez and asking to speak with someone about accessing safety deposit box records. At exactly 9 a.m., a woman approached Sarah from the direction of the safety deposit box area. She was middle-aged, professionally dressed, and moved with the confidence of someone familiar with the bank environment. Her appearance matched Reston's description of the mysterious contact person who had orchestrated the burglary, but Sarah remained cautious about jumping to conclusions. "Detective Martinez? I'm Janet Williams, assistant manager here at First National. I believe you're here about the Harold Chin safety deposit box situation." Sarah nodded carefully, keeping her hands free and her senses alert for any sign that this was not what it appeared to be. "I received a message suggesting there was information I needed to see regarding Mr. Chin's financial arrangements." Williams gestured toward a private conference room adjacent to the safety deposit box area. "There's quite a bit to explain, and I think you'll want to see the documentation we've discovered. It involves not just Harold Chin, but several other elderly clients whose accounts show similar irregularities." This revelation immediately escalated Sarah's assessment of the situation. If Harold Chin had been part of a pattern of financial exploitation targeting elderly victims, they were looking at a much larger criminal operation than anyone had initially suspected. As they walked toward the conference room, Williams continued speaking in a low voice that wouldn't carry to other customers. "I want to be clear about something from the start, Detective. I sent you that text message last night after I heard about Rebecca Morrison's death on the news. I've been investigating irregularities in several client accounts for the past month, and Morrison's name kept appearing in connection with unauthorized access to financial information." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and increased alertness. Williams wasn't the mysterious criminal contact, but rather a bank employee who had discovered evidence of financial crimes. This was potentially much better for the investigation, though it also meant that the real criminals were still unidentified and possibly dangerous. The conference room was small and windowless, but Williams had prepared a comprehensive display of documents and computer printouts that immediately caught Sarah's attention. Bank records, transaction summaries, and correspondence files covered most of the table's surface. "What you're looking at here represents approximately 18 months of suspicious activity involving elderly account holders," Williams began, settling into a chair across from Sarah. Harold Chin was one of 7 clients whose accounts showed unusual patterns of investment changes, insurance policy modifications, and safety deposit box access by unauthorized persons. Sarah began examining the documents while keeping her radio connection open so the surveillance team could hear the conversation. The pattern Williams had identified was both sophisticated and disturbing. elderly clients with significant assets were being systematically manipulated into making financial changes that ultimately benefited unknown third parties. Rebecca Morrison had legitimate access to some of these accounts through her role as a tax preparer and financial advisor, Williams explained, pointing to specific transaction records. But she was also accessing information about clients who weren't officially working with her, and she was making copies of documents that should have remained confidential. Mike's voice came through Sarah's earpiece, barely audible, but clear. "Martinez, we've got movement outside." Two men in a dark sedan have been circling the block for the past 5 minutes. They don't look like typical bank customers. Sarah acknowledged the warning with a subtle nod while maintaining her focus on Williams, and the evidence spread across the table. The timing of surveillance activity outside the bank suggested that someone else was monitoring this meeting, though their intentions remained unclear. "Ms. Williams, I need you to tell me exactly who else knows about your investigation and this meeting," Sarah said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used in potentially dangerous situations. Williams looked concerned, but answered promptly. "Only myself and my supervisor, Robert Chun, who happens to be Harold's nephew. He's the one who initially noticed irregularities in his uncle's accounts and asked me to investigate." This family connection added another layer of complexity to the situation. Robert Chun had legitimate reasons to be concerned about his uncle's financial affairs, but it also meant that information about the investigation could have been shared with other family members or associates. Sarah's radio crackled again with an update from Harrison. "Martinez, we're tracking 2 additional vehicles that have taken up surveillance positions around the bank. This doesn't feel like a coincidence. Are you getting what you need in there?" Before Sarah could respond, Williams produced a key from her desk drawer and set it on the table between them. "This is Harold Chen's safety deposit box key. We found it among Rebecca Morrison's personal effects when her office was searched last night. She had no legitimate reason to possess this key. The implications were immediate and serious. If Morrison had Harold's safety deposit box key, she could have been accessing his valuables for months without his knowledge or consent. This suggested a level of betrayal and criminal activity that went far beyond the burglary attempt at Mrs. Chen's house. "I need to see what's in that box," Sarah told Williams, though she was also acutely aware of the surveillance activity outside and the increasing tension in the situation. Williams led her to the safety deposit box area, where a bank security guard unlocked the access door and retrieved box number 247. The metal container was smaller than Sarah had expected, but as Williams opened it under the supervision of bank protocol, the contents immediately revealed the scope of Rebecca Morrison's criminal activities. The box contained documents that should have been filed with probate court, including a more recent version of Harold Chen's will that left significantly more money to his nephew Robert than the version that had been officially filed. There were also insurance policies with different beneficiaries than the ones Mrs. Chun knew about, and investment records showing accounts that contained hundreds of thousands of dollars in assets. Morrison was systematically hiding financial information from Harold's widow, Sarah concluded, photographing the documents with her phone while the bank guard maintained official oversight of the process. "Mrs. Chun has no idea how much money her husband actually left behind." Williams nodded grimly. "And based on the patterns we've identified in other accounts, Morrison was probably taking a percentage of these hidden assets as payment for her services. She was essentially stealing from widows and elderly clients by concealing their legitimate inheritances." Sarah's radio erupted with urgent communication from the surveillance team. "Martinez, you need to get out of there now. We've got armed suspects moving toward the bank entrances. This is not a drill." The situation had suddenly escalated from investigation to immediate danger. Sarah drew her weapon while instructing Williams to move toward the rear of the bank, away from the public areas where civilians could be caught in potential crossfire. "Call 911 and request immediate police response," Sarah told the bank security guard, though she suspected the surveillance team had already initiated emergency protocols. "Lock down the bank and keep customers away from the front windows." Through her earpiece, Sarah could hear Mike coordinating with Harrison and the backup units. "Suspects are approaching from both the front and rear entrances. 4 men, armed, moving with tactical awareness. This looks like a coordinated assault." Sarah realized that someone had been monitoring her investigation and had decided to eliminate witnesses and evidence before the law enforcement operation could be completed. The anonymous text message might have been a trap after all, designed to draw her and the evidence into a location where both could be destroyed. "Williams, is there another way out of this area?" Sarah asked, though she was also preparing to defend their position if necessary. The bank manager pointed toward a service corridor that led to the employee parking area. "That hallway connects to the rear loading dock, but if they're covering both entrances, they might have that area under surveillance too." The sound of the bank's main door opening caused Sarah to position herself where she could cover the safety deposit box area while maintaining visual contact with the corridor Williams had indicated. She could hear voices in the main banking area, but couldn't tell if they belonged to customers, employees, or the armed suspects the surveillance team had identified. Mike's voice came through her earpiece again, tense but controlled. "Martinez, I'm moving toward your position. We've got customers and employees secured in the main area, but we're dealing with at least 4 armed suspects who seem to know exactly where they're going." This suggested that the suspects had inside information about the bank's layout and possibly about the specific location where Sarah was meeting with Williams. Someone with detailed knowledge of the investigation had orchestrated this confrontation. Sarah heard footsteps approaching through the service corridor Williams had identified as an alternate exit. She positioned herself to cover both potential approach routes while keeping Williams behind substantial cover provided by the safety deposit box vault structure. "Police, identify yourselves," Sarah called out, though she was prepared for the response to be hostile. 2 men appeared at the entrance to the safety deposit box area, both carrying handguns and moving with the coordination of experienced criminals. Sarah recognized one of them as Marcus Webb, the burglar she had arrested at Mrs. Chen's house less than 12 hours earlier. "Nobody moves and nobody gets hurt," Webb announced, though his demeanor suggested he had no intention of leaving witnesses. "We just need those documents you've been looking at, and then we'll be on our way." Sarah kept her weapon trained on Webb while calculating tactical options. She was outnumbered, but she had cover and training advantages. More importantly, backup was somewhere in the building, and additional law enforcement units were undoubtedly responding to the emergency calls. "Mr. Webb, you're looking at multiple felony charges already. Don't make this worse by threatening a police officer and innocent civilians," Sarah said, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the dangerous circumstances. Webb's partner, a man Sarah didn't recognize from the previous night's arrests, moved to flank her position. Sarah adjusted her stance to cover both threats while keeping Williams protected behind the vault structure. "The documents in that safety deposit box belong to people who are willing to kill to keep their secrets," Webb told her, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. Rebecca Morrison found that out the hard way. This confirmed Sarah's suspicion that Morrison's death hadn't been suicide. Webb was essentially confessing to murder while threatening to add Sarah and Williams to his list of victims. The sound of automatic weapons fire from the main banking area indicated that the confrontation had escalated beyond what any of them had anticipated. Sarah heard Mike's voice shouting commands, but the specific words were lost in the chaos of what had become an active shooter situation. "Williams, stay behind that vault, and don't move until I tell you," Sarah instructed, though her focus remained on the 2 armed men who were now separated enough to create a significant tactical challenge. Webb was clearly the more experienced and dangerous of the 2 suspects. His movement and positioning showed military or law enforcement training, suggesting that this criminal organization had resources and expertise beyond typical street criminals. "Detective Martinez, you have about 30 seconds to hand over those documents before my associates in the main banking area start eliminating hostages," Webb announced, apparently believing that threatening innocent civilians would force her compliance. Sarah's training and experience told her that giving in to such demands rarely resulted in the promised safety for hostages or witnesses. Webb and his associates had already committed multiple felonies and wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who could identify them. Instead of complying, Sarah used her radio to update the tactical situation. "This is Martinez. We have confirmed threats against hostages in the main banking area. Suspects are demanding evidence related to financial crimes and have indicated willingness to kill witnesses. The response from Harrison was immediate and reassuring. Copy that, Martinez. SWAT is 90 seconds out, and we've got the building surrounded. Hold your position and protect those documents. Webb apparently heard enough of this communication to realize that his tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. His expression shifted from confidence to desperation, making him significantly more dangerous and unpredictable. Change of plans, Webb announced to his partner. We eliminate the witnesses and destroy the evidence right here. Both men raised their weapons towards Sarah's position, forcing her to make a split-second decision about when and how to engage. She had excellent cover, but Williams was depending on her for protection, and the documents that could expose the entire criminal conspiracy were within a few feet of potential destruction. Sarah fired twice in rapid succession, her training and muscle memory taking over in the high-stress situation. Webb went down immediately, but his partner managed to take cover behind a pillar and return fire, forcing Sarah to adjust her position to maintain protection for Williams. The gunfight was brief but intense, lasting less than 30 seconds before the sound of SWAT officers entering the building changed the tactical equation completely. Webb's partner dropped his weapon and surrendered when faced with overwhelming law enforcement response. As the immediate danger ended, Sarah finally had a chance to check on Williams and assess the situation in the main banking area. Mike's voice came through her earpiece with a welcome all-clear message, confirming that the hostages were safe and the remaining suspects were in custody. The investigation that had begun with a simple off-duty burglary had evolved into a major financial crime operation involving murder, bank robbery, and conspiracy charges that would likely result in federal prosecution. The documents in Harold Chen's safety deposit box provided the evidence needed to unravel a sophisticated scheme that had been targeting elderly victims throughout the region. As Sarah emerged from the safety deposit box area, she was met by Harrison and a team of federal agents who had been monitoring the investigation since Rebecca Morrison's death. The scope of the criminal enterprise was apparently much larger than anyone had initially suspected. Detective Martinez, we've been tracking this organization for 8 months through a multi-state investigation, the lead federal agent explained as paramedics checked Sarah and Williams for injuries. Your arrest of Webb and Reston last night broke open the case we've been building against them. The federal involvement explained why the criminals had been so desperate to recover the documents and eliminate witnesses. They weren't just facing local charges for burglary and fraud, but federal prosecution for an organized criminal enterprise that had been operating across state lines. Over the following hours, as statements were taken and evidence was processed, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Rebecca Morrison had been recruited by the criminal organization to identify elderly clients with significant assets, then systematically manipulated their financial arrangements to hide money that could later be stolen. Harold Chun had discovered Morrison's activities in the weeks before his death and had been preparing to expose her when he died of natural causes. Morrison had then accelerated her timeline for stealing from his estate, leading to the burglary attempt that Sarah had interrupted. Mrs. Chun, unaware of her husband's hidden assets, would have been left with a fraction of her rightful inheritance while the criminal organization profited from money that legally belonged to her. The safety deposit box documents proved that she was entitled to nearly $500,000 more than she had been told about. As Sarah finally headed home 18 hours after her shift was supposed to have ended, she reflected on the chain of events that had begun with her simple observation of unusual lights in her neighbor's house. A routine off-duty arrest had evolved into a federal investigation that would likely result in justice for multiple victims and the dismantling of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Mrs. Chin called her that afternoon, tearful with gratitude for both her safety and the discovery of her husband's hidden assets. The elderly woman would be financially secure for the rest of her life, thanks to documents that criminals had been willing to kill to conceal. The investigation would continue for months as federal prosecutors built cases against the various members of the criminal organization. But, for Sarah, the most satisfying part was knowing that her split-second decision to act when she saw something wrong had ultimately protected an innocent person and exposed a conspiracy that might have continued victimizing elderly people for years. Sometimes being a police officer meant making the right choice in the moment, even when you couldn't see all the consequences that would follow. Tonight had been one of those times, and Sarah went to sleep knowing that her commitment to protecting and serving had made a genuine difference in the lives of people she might never meet. The case would be studied in law enforcement academies as an example of how small observations and quick decisions could unravel major criminal enterprises. For Sarah, it was simply another reminder of why she had chosen this profession 23 years ago, and why she would continue serving her community for as long as she was able. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in the cramped interview room at the county sheriff's station, nursing her fourth cup of coffee and reviewing the preliminary reports that were painting a picture far more complex than she had initially imagined. The two suspects, now identified as Marcus Webb, 24, and Tyler Reston, 19, had criminal histories that suggested this wasn't their first rodeo with breaking and entering. Webb, the older and apparently more experienced of the two, had a rap sheet that included burglary, theft, and drug possession charges dating back 6 years. His most recent arrest had been 18 months ago for a home invasion that bore striking similarities to tonight's incident. He had served 8 months and been released on parole just 4 months ago. Reston was different. His record was shorter, but more concerning in some ways. 2 arrests for drug possession, 1 for assault, and a juvenile record that was sealed but hinted at early involvement with criminal activity. What worried Sarah most was the escalating pattern of violence in his recent charges. Detective Mike Rodriguez had arrived at the scene within an hour of Sarah's text message, despite being officially off-duty himself. Their partnership went back 8 years, and he knew that Sarah wouldn't have called unless the situation was serious. Now he sat across from her, reading through the same reports with a frown that deepened with each page. "This doesn't feel random," Mike said, echoing Sarah's own thoughts. They knew too much about Mrs. Chen's house, her routines, her husband's background. Someone gave them information. Sarah nodded, pulling out her notebook where she had jotted down key details from Mrs. Chen's statement. "She told me they specifically asked about Harold's war bonds and mentioned something about investments he made before he died. That's not general knowledge. Harold Chen worked as an accountant for 40 years, mostly small businesses and individual tax returns. He wasn't the type to have secret fortunes hidden away." The door to the interview room opened, and County Detective Linda Harrison entered with a thick file folder and a grim expression. Harrison was known throughout the region as a thorough investigator who didn't miss details, and her presence suggested that this case had already attracted significant attention from the county sheriff's department. "Detective Martinez, I wanted to thank you personally for your quick action tonight," Harrison said, settling into a chair beside Mike. "Mrs. Chun is shaken up, but physically fine, and we might have been looking at a much worse situation if you hadn't intervened when you did." Sarah accepted the thanks with a modest nod, but her mind was already focused on the investigation ahead. "What did you get from the initial interviews with Webb and Reston?" Harrison opened her file and spread several documents across the table. "Webb is playing the experienced criminal card, asking for a lawyer and keeping his mouth shut. Reston, on the other hand, is scared and talking, though I'm not sure how much of what he's saying is reliable." The detective pulled out a transcript of Reston's statement and handed it to Sarah. According to him, they were approached 3 weeks ago by someone who told them that Harold Chun had hidden a significant amount of cash and valuables in his house before he died. The contact person claimed to have inside information about Chen's financial dealings and promised them a substantial cut if they could retrieve the items. Mike leaned forward, his interest obviously piqued. "Did Reston identify this contact person?" "That's where it gets interesting," Harrison continued. "He says they only met the person once, in a bar downtown, and all communication after that was through text messages from a burner phone. The contact was described as a middle-aged woman, well-dressed, who seemed to know a lot about the Chun family's business." Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in her mind, though the complete picture was still unclear. Did Mrs. Chun mention anyone who might have had access to information about her husband's finances? Someone who worked with him or had reason to know about their personal affairs? Harrison consulted another document from her file. "I asked her about that specifically. She mentioned that Harold used the same accountant for their personal taxes for the last 15 years, a woman named Rebecca Morrison who runs a small firm downtown. Mrs. Chin also said that Harold had been having some kind of dispute with Morrison in the months before he died, something about investments that weren't performing as expected. The name Rebecca Morrison struck a chord with Sarah, though she couldn't immediately place where she had heard it before. She made a note to run the name through the police database when she got back to her own station. There's something else, Harrison continued, pulling out an evidence bag containing a cell phone. We found this in Webb's car. It's got text messages from an unknown number with specific details about Mrs. Chen's schedule, information about when she typically goes to bed, even details about her security system. Sarah examined the phone through the plastic bag, noting the timestamps on the visible messages. Someone was definitely feeding them intelligence about the target. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. Mike was studying the transcript of Reston's statement when something caught his attention. Look at this part here, where Reston talks about what they were specifically looking for. He mentions war bonds, but also says the contact person told them about a safe behind a false wall in the basement. Mrs. Chun doesn't have a basement. Her house is built on a concrete slab. Harrison nodded grimly. That's what made us realize that either the contact person was working from bad information, or they were deliberately setting Webb and Reston up to fail. The question is why someone would orchestrate a burglary that was doomed from the start. The implications of this revelation were troubling. If the mysterious contact person had deliberately provided false information, it suggested motives beyond simple theft. Someone might have wanted Webb and Reston to be caught, or perhaps they had used the burglary as a distraction for some other purpose. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her supervisor, Lieutenant Patricia Hawkins, who rarely called unless something significant was happening. Martinez here. Sarah, I know you're technically off duty, but I just got a call from Chief Morrison over at County. He wants to know if you're available to assist with the Chun burglary investigation. Apparently, your arrest of the suspects was just the beginning of something much larger. Sarah glanced at Mike and Harrison, both of whom were watching her with expectant expressions. I'm already here at County, reviewing the case files. What else has developed? About an hour ago, Rebecca Morrison, the accountant I'm told was mentioned in connection with the Chin family, was found dead in her office downtown. Initial assessment suggests suicide, but the timing is too convenient to ignore. County wants someone with your experience to take a look at the scene. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly shifted into a completely different configuration in Sarah's mind. Rebecca Morrison wasn't just connected to this case. She was apparently central to it. And if her death was related to tonight's events, the investigation had just become exponentially more complicated. I'll head over there now, Sarah told her lieutenant. Can you authorize overtime for this? I have a feeling this is going to be a long investigation. After ending the call, Sarah shared the news about Morrison's death with Harrison and Mike. The reaction was immediate and concerned. That can't be a coincidence, Harrison said, already gathering her files. If Morrison was the contact person who set up Webb and Reston, her death suggests she was either eliminating evidence or someone else was eliminating her as a witness. Mike was already standing, checking his weapon and badge. I'm coming with you. This case just became a potential homicide investigation, and you'll need backup. Sarah appreciated the support, though she was also concerned about dragging her partner into what was shaping up to be a complex and dangerous situation. Still, Mike's experience and insight would be valuable, especially if they were dealing with multiple connected crimes. The drive to Morrison's office took them through the quiet downtown area, past businesses that had been closed for hours, and streets that were nearly empty except for the occasional patrol car. The accountant's office was located in a two-story building that housed several small professional services, and Sarah could see police tape and emergency vehicles from 2 blocks away. County Detective Harrison met them at the scene, introducing them to the coroner and crime scene technicians who were still processing Morrison's office. The initial assessment was troubling. Morrison had apparently shot herself with a .38 caliber handgun that was registered in her name, but several details about the scene didn't fit the typical pattern of a suicide. The weapon was found in her right hand, but Morrison was left-handed according to her office manager. The coroner explained as they examined the scene. There's also no suicide note, which is unusual for someone in a planned financial crime situation. Sarah noted the position of the body and the condition of the office. Morrison's desk had been thoroughly searched, with papers scattered and file cabinets left open. Either she had been looking for something specific before her death, or someone else had searched the office after she died. What did Morrison's client files tell you about her relationship with Harold Chun? Sarah asked Harrison as they moved through the office carefully, avoiding disturbing the ongoing crime scene processing. Harrison consulted her notes. According to the files we've been able to review, Harold Chun had been Morrison's client for 15 years. In the last year of his life, he had moved several significant investments from one portfolio to another, apparently on Morrison's advice. The problem is, those investments lost substantial value after the transfer. Mike was examining Morrison's computer, which had been left running with several financial programs open. "Look at this," he called them over. Morrison was reviewing Harold Chin's account information as recently as yesterday. She had accessed files related to his life insurance policy and some investment accounts that weren't mentioned in the estate paperwork. This discovery suggested that Morrison had been actively researching the Chun family's finances in the days leading up to the burglary. Whether she was planning the crime herself or investigating discrepancies in Harold's accounts remained unclear. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. She opened it cautiously, mindful of the strange connections and communications that had already characterized this case. The message was brief but disturbing. "Detective Martinez, you need to check Harold Chin's safety deposit box." As they continued to process Morrison's office, additional details emerged that painted a picture of a woman under significant financial and legal pressure. Her business bank account showed several large, unexplained deposits in the weeks before Harold Chin's death, followed by equally large withdrawals just days later. Someone was paying Morrison for something, Sarah concluded, reviewing the bank records with Harrison. The question is whether she was being paid to steal from Harold Chun or to provide information about his finances to other people. A crime scene technician called them over to Morrison's desk, where she had discovered a hidden compartment containing additional documents. Among them were copies of Harold Chin's will, insurance policies, and investment records that weren't part of his official estate filing. Morrison was definitely tracking more of Harold's assets than she had legitimate access to, the technician explained. Some of these documents appear to be photocopies of original records that should have been filed with the probate court. Mike was studying the investment records when he noticed something unusual. "Look at these transaction dates. Harold supposedly moved these investments 6 months before he died, but the paperwork is dated just 2 weeks before his death. Either someone backdated these documents, or Harold made additional changes to his portfolio that weren't reported to his wife." This discrepancy suggested that either Harold Chun had been planning something in secret during his final weeks, or Rebecca Morrison had been manipulating his accounts without his knowledge. Either scenario had serious implications for understanding the motives behind tonight's burglary and Morrison's apparent suicide. Sarah was beginning to see a pattern of financial manipulation and deception that went far beyond a simple break-in. Someone had been systematically exploiting Harold Chin's trust and accessing his assets through his relationship with Morrison. Tonight's burglary might have been intended to retrieve evidence of that exploitation or to cover up financial crimes that had been ongoing for months. The anonymous text message about the safety deposit box suggested that there were still undiscovered elements to Harold Chin's financial affairs. If someone else had been monitoring or participating in Morrison's activities, they might have information that could unravel the entire conspiracy. As the crime scene processing continued into the early morning hours, Sarah found herself mentally preparing for what promised to be a dangerous and complex investigation. The person who had sent that text message might be trying to help, but they could just as easily be leading her into a trap designed to eliminate another potential witness. The sun was beginning to rise over the downtown area as Sarah, Mike, and Harrison finally left Morrison's office. They had gathered enough evidence to confirm that Rebecca Morrison's death was connected to the Chun family burglary, and that both crimes were part of a larger pattern of financial manipulation and fraud. The meeting at First National Bank was still several hours away, giving them time to plan a proper surveillance operation and gather additional resources. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. and that the person who had sent that anonymous message might hold the key to understanding everything that had happened. As they drove back through the quiet morning streets, Sarah reflected on how a routine night off duty had evolved into one of the most complex investigations of her career. Mrs. Chun was safe, but the criminals responsible for threatening her were apparently part of a conspiracy that had cost at least one person her life, and might have been systematically defrauding elderly victims for months or years. The investigation was far from over, and Sarah suspected that the most dangerous revelations were still ahead of them. Detective Sarah Martinez pulled into her driveway at 11:47 p.m., the headlights of her unmarked sedan cutting through the darkness of her quiet suburban neighborhood. The engine ticked as it cooled, and she sat for a moment, letting the weight of another 14-hour shift settle on her shoulders. 3 domestic violence calls, 2 armed robberies, and a missing person case that was keeping her awake at night. All she wanted was a hot shower and 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep before her phone started ringing again. She grabbed her service weapon from the passenger seat, ensuring it was properly secured in its holster beneath her jacket. 23 years on the force had taught her that trouble didn't respect schedules or boundaries, and even in her own neighborhood, she remained alert. The street was peaceful, lined with modest 2-story homes where families slept soundly behind locked doors and security systems. As Sarah walked toward her front door, fishing for keys in her jacket pocket, she noticed something that made her pause. Mrs. Chen's house, 3 doors down, had every light blazing. The elderly woman was meticulous about conserving electricity, often lecturing the neighborhood kids about leaving porch lights on. Seeing her house lit up like a Christmas tree at midnight was unusual enough to catch Sarah's attention. She hesitated on her front step, keys halfway to the lock. Mrs. Chun was 78 years old, lived alone since her husband passed 5 years ago, and rarely stayed up past 9 o'clock. Sarah had checked on her during the ice storm last winter and knew the woman's routines well. Something felt wrong about the scene, but Sarah couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. A movement in one of the upstairs windows caught her eye. Someone was moving around inside, but the figure seemed too tall and broad to be Mrs. Chun. Sarah's instincts, honed by decades of police work, began sending warning signals through her nervous system. She stepped away from her door and moved closer to the street, trying to get a better view of the Chun house without being obvious about her surveillance. The front door of the house opened, and Sarah quickly ducked behind a parked car. A man emerged, definitely not Mrs. Chun, carrying what appeared to be a small television or electronic device. He was young, maybe early 20s, wearing a dark hoodie and moving with the quick, nervous energy of someone who didn't belong. He placed the item in the back of a beat-up sedan parked in Mrs. Chen's driveway. Sarah's heart rate increased as she reached for her phone. This was clearly a burglary in progress, but she was off-duty, exhausted, and technically outside her jurisdiction since she worked for the city police, and this was county territory. The smart thing would be to call it in and let the county sheriff's department handle it. But Mrs. Chun was a sweet old lady who brought her homemade cookies every Christmas, and Sarah couldn't just stand by and watch her house being robbed. The man went back inside the house, and Sarah made a quick decision. She called 911, keeping her voice low as she identified herself to the dispatcher and reported the burglary. The estimated response time was 8 to 12 minutes, which felt like an eternity when she thought about what could be happening to Mrs. Chun inside that house. Sarah weighed her options carefully. She could wait for backup, but if Mrs. Chun was hurt or in immediate danger, those minutes could be critical. She had her service weapon, her training, and the element of surprise. The burglar didn't know she was there, and she might be able to prevent the situation from escalating. She moved closer to the house, staying in the shadows and using parked cars for cover. The front door was still open, providing her with a clear view of the entryway. She could hear voices inside, but couldn't make out the words. At least one voice sounded like it belonged to Mrs. Chun, which was both reassuring and concerning. If she was talking, she was alive, but Sarah couldn't tell if she was being threatened or coerced. The burglar appeared again, this time carrying a laptop computer and what looked like jewelry box. He was moving with more confidence now, apparently convinced that he was alone and unobserved. Sarah noted his physical description for the report she would file later. Approximately 6 feet tall, thin build, dark clothing, Caucasian male with short brown hair. As she watched, Sarah realized this wasn't a random break-in. The man knew exactly what he was looking for and where to find it. He moved through the house with purpose, suggesting he had been there before or had some knowledge of the layout and contents. This made the situation more complex and potentially more dangerous. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from the dispatcher, updating her that units were en route, but delayed due to a multi-vehicle accident on the highway. Response time was now estimated at 15 to 20 minutes. She felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with making split-second decisions in high-pressure situations. Moving carefully along the side of the house, Sarah positioned herself where she could see into the living room through a large picture window. Mrs. Chun was sitting in her favorite armchair, still in her nightgown and robe, looking frightened but unharmed. The burglar was rummaging through a desk drawer, occasionally glancing at the elderly woman as if ensuring she stayed put. Sarah considered her tactical options. The house had a front door, a back door that opened onto a small patio, and several windows. If she tried to enter through the back, she might be able to surprise the intruder, but she would also be putting herself at significant risk without backup. If something went wrong, both she and Mrs. Chun could end up as victims. The sound of another car pulling into the driveway made Sarah's pulse spike. A second vehicle meant either backup for the burglar or an innocent person walking into a dangerous situation. She watched as another young man got out of a newer pickup truck and walked casually toward the front door. This was escalating beyond a simple burglary. Sarah immediately called the emergency dispatcher again, updating the situation to include a second suspect and requesting immediate priority response. The dispatcher confirmed that the first available unit was still at least 10 minutes away, but they were trying to pull officers from neighboring districts. The second man entered the house, and Sarah could hear their voices more clearly now. They were discussing something about a safe and arguing about whether they had enough time to find it. One of them mentioned that the old lady was being uncooperative about the combination. Sarah's protective instincts kicked into high gear. These weren't just thieves anymore. They were potentially becoming kidnappers or worse. She made a tactical assessment of her position and resources. She was outnumbered 2 to 1, but she had the advantage of surprise, superior training, and a legitimate law enforcement background. More importantly, she had a legal and moral obligation to protect Mrs. Chun from harm. Sarah moved to a position where she could see both the front and back exits of the house. If the situation deteriorated and the men tried to flee with Mrs. Chun, or if they became violent toward her, Sarah would have to act regardless of the odds against her. Through the window, she watched as one of the men became increasingly agitated. He was gesturing wildly and speaking in a raised voice, though she still couldn't make out the specific words. Mrs. Chun appeared to be crying, which triggered every protective instinct Sarah had developed over her career in law enforcement. The decision crystallized in her mind with startling clarity. She couldn't wait for backup when an innocent person was being threatened. She had sworn an oath to protect and serve, and that oath didn't come with time limits or jurisdictional boundaries. Mrs. Chun needed help now, and Sarah was the only one in position to provide it. Sarah checked her weapon one more time, ensuring a round was chambered and the safety was off. She mentally reviewed the layout of the house from her previous visit during the ice storm, mapping out potential cover positions and escape routes. The element of surprise would be crucial, but she would also need to be prepared for the situation to go badly. She sent a quick text to her partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez, letting him know her location and situation in case something happened to her. It was a precaution that had saved lives before, and she wasn't taking any chances with Mrs. Chen's safety or her own. Moving to the front of the house, Sarah positioned herself beside the open door where she could hear the conversation inside more clearly. One of the men was demanding that Mrs. Chen tell them where her husband had hidden his money. The elderly woman was insisting that there was no hidden money, that everything was in the bank where it belonged. Sarah's radio crackled softly with an update from dispatch. The first responding unit was still 8 minutes out, but a state trooper who had been patrolling the highway was closer and might arrive in 5 or 6 minutes. Every second felt like an hour when she thought about what could happen to Mrs. Chun in that time. The sound of furniture being overturned came from inside the house, followed by Mrs. Chin's frightened cry. That was the tipping point for Sarah. She couldn't stand by and listen to an elderly woman being terrorized in her own home, regardless of departmental protocols or personal safety concerns. Sarah took a deep breath, steadied her nerves, and stepped into the doorway with her weapon drawn. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had faced down dangerous criminals for over 2 decades. Police. Nobody moved. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Both men froze, one of them dropping a picture frame that shattered on the hardwood floor. Mrs. Chin looked toward the door with obvious relief, her eyes wide but hopeful for the first time since this ordeal began. The first burglar, the one Sarah had been watching, slowly turned toward her with his hands partially raised. His face showed surprise, but not panic, suggesting he might be more experienced with law enforcement encounters than she had initially thought. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Sarah commanded, maintaining her position in the doorway where she could cover both suspects while keeping an exit route clear. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Mrs. Chin shook her head, tears streaming down her face, but her voice stronger than expected. "I'm okay, dear. They've been here for about 20 minutes. Looking for money they think my husband hid somewhere." The second man, who had been searching through a cabinet when Sarah appeared, was younger and clearly more nervous. His hands were shaking as he raised them, and Sarah could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the house. "Both of you, turn around slowly and put your hands on the wall," Sarah instructed, keeping her weapon trained on them while mentally calculating distances and potential threats. The nervous one was closer to Mrs. Chun, which complicated the tactical situation. The older suspect complied immediately, moving to the wall with practiced ease that suggested prior arrests. The younger one hesitated, glancing between Sarah and his partner as if looking for guidance or an opportunity to escape. "Don't even think about it," Sarah warned, recognizing the body language that preceded flight attempts. "You're already looking at breaking and entering. Don't make it worse by running or doing something stupid." The sound of sirens in the distance provided welcome relief. Backup was finally arriving, though Sarah couldn't tell how close they were yet. She needed to maintain control of the situation for just a few more minutes. The younger suspect suddenly made his move, lunging toward the back door instead of complying with Sarah's commands. She had anticipated this possibility and was ready to react, but his movement also put him dangerously close to Mrs. Chen's chair. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She couldn't fire her weapon with Mrs. Chun in potential crossfire, so she had to rely on verbal commands and positioning to control the situation. "Stop right there. Don't make this worse than it already is." The young man paused at the back door, apparently realizing that his escape route might be blocked by arriving police units. He turned back toward the room, his face showing panic and desperation that made him unpredictable and dangerous. Sarah maintained her defensive position while keeping both suspects in view. The older one remained against the wall with his hands up, apparently smart enough to know when he was beaten. The younger one was still a wild card, moving nervously and looking for options that didn't exist. "Listen to me carefully," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "You're surrounded. There are police units outside, and more on the way. The smart thing to do is cooperate now and maybe work out a deal later. Don't turn this into something that ruins the rest of your life." Mrs. Chin spoke up from her chair, her voice surprisingly steady. "Officer, they said they knew my herald had money hidden somewhere, but he never hid money. He was too practical for that. Everything went to the bank or into investments." This information gave Sarah insight into the burglar's motivation and planning. They weren't random thieves, but had specifically targeted Mrs. Chun based on some belief or information about hidden assets. This suggested a more organized criminal operation than a simple break-in. The sirens were getting closer, and Sarah could see flashing lights beginning to reflect off the windows of neighboring houses. The cavalry was almost there, and she just needed to maintain control for another minute or two. The older suspect seemed to recognize that his situation was hopeless. "Look, officer, we didn't hurt anybody. We were just looking for something that belongs to us. This is all a misunderstanding." Sarah didn't buy the story for a second, but she needed to keep him talking and calm. We'll sort all that out once backup arrives. Right now, I need both of you to stay exactly where you are and keep your hands visible. The younger suspect was still near the back door, but Sarah could see his resolve weakening as the sound of approaching police units grew louder. His partner's resignation seemed to be affecting his decision-making process. Don't listen to him, Sarah called to the younger man. You make your own choices here. Smart choices. Choices that don't involve making this situation worse than it already is. The first police cruiser pulled into the driveway, its spotlight illuminating the front of the house. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she maintained her alert posture and weapon-ready position. This is Detective Sarah Martinez, Metro PD. She called out loudly for the arriving officers. I have 2 suspects inside, one elderly victim who appears unharmed. I'm armed and positioned in the front doorway. The response from outside was immediate and professional. Copy that, Detective Martinez. This is Sergeant Williams, County Sheriff. We're setting up a perimeter. Do you need immediate assistance inside? Sarah assessed the situation quickly. Both suspects seemed defeated and unlikely to resist further, but she wanted proper backup before attempting to secure them. Affirmative, Sergeant. I could use 2 officers inside to help secure these suspects. Within moments, 2 county deputies entered the house, their weapons drawn and ready. The tactical situation shifted immediately as the suspects found themselves facing multiple law enforcement officers with no viable escape options. The arrest process went smoothly from that point. Both men surrendered without further resistance, allowing themselves to be handcuffed and secured while Mrs. Chun gave her initial statement about what had happened. As the immediate crisis ended, Sarah finally had a chance to process what had just occurred. She had successfully prevented a potential escalation of violence, protected an innocent victim, and apprehended 2 criminals. It had been a good night's work, even if it meant she wouldn't be getting that hot shower and 6 hours of sleep anytime soon. The investigation was just beginning, and Sarah suspected there was much more to this story than a simple burglary gone wrong. The suspect's specific interest in hidden money and their apparent knowledge of Mrs. Chin's deceased husband's suggested connections and motivations that would require careful investigation to uncover. As she watched the suspects being loaded into police cars and Mrs. Chun being checked by paramedics, Sarah reflected on the split-second decisions that had defined the last hour of her life. Sometimes being a police officer meant making choices based on instinct and training, even when you were off duty and exhausted. Tonight had been one of those times, and it had turned out well for everyone except the criminals. The paperwork would be extensive, the investigation would be complex, and the court proceedings would likely drag on for months. But Mrs. Chun was safe, 2 dangerous criminals were off the street, and Sarah had once again proven to herself why she had chosen law enforcement as her career 23 years ago. The night was far from over, but the most dangerous part was behind them. Now came the methodical work of building a case that would ensure these men faced appropriate consequences for their actions, and that Mrs. Chun could sleep safely in her own home again.